To. Oh, Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's rise to talk on this new bill, the Harmful Digital Communications Bill, and indicate that the Labor Party will support the bill to the Select Committee for closer examination. It's fair to say that this bill is yet another step in the struggle for the law and for Parliament to catch up with and make some order out of the anarchistic or anarchic world of the internet and social media. The objectives of the bill are, needless to say, laudable. They are about mitigating harm, and we have seen in a very extreme example just in the last couple of weeks how social media at least can be used to be humiliating and abusive to people who may not have known originally that they were being treated in that sort of way. The objective that says that it is about providing a quick and efficient means of redress, I have to say, looks more cynical when you see that that means of redress is to be obtained by private action, private civil action in the district court. Cynical because it is then left up to the victim or the putative victim to have to meet the cost of going to court to apply for an order, whether they're interim orders and get material taken down, or long-standing or permanent orders that are slightly more punitive. Nevertheless, it is the victim who has to meet that cost. There wouldn't be many people, I suggest, who are active on social media today and frequent users of the internet, let's call them the digital natives, who have the means to instruct counsel and go to court for these sorts of things. And of course the other reason for my cynicism is that the district court is already overloaded and there are long delays in many courts, and so there is a real question about whether it has the capacity to pick up an extra load of work given the growing numbers of people who are daily active on the internet and in social media. Mr Speaker, another issue that we will be examining closely when this goes to the Select Committee is that one of the faults in our view of this bill is the same as others being sponsored by the same minister, not the minister who just spoke, Mr Boris, but the Minister of Justice, Judith Collins. And let me draw a comparison with the Victims' Orders Against Violent Offenders bill. That again is dependent on civil action. The victim has to meet the cost of dealing with something that actually the criminal justice system and the state might be better equipped to deal with. The harmed person has to go to the district court. They have to go at their expense. There is, under the modern legal aid regime, real doubt about whether they will qualify for legal aid, and even if they do, they may well be subject to the requirement to repay it, and that repayment is then subject to interest. This is not looking good for the people who are most likely to be victims of abuse on the internet, and therefore the people who are needing to avail themselves of this legislation. And so we will be asking whether or not, if it is to remain in the civil jurisdiction, whether some easily accessible means can be made available to ensure that people can actually partake of the provisions in this bill. Just turning to some of the issues of substance in the bill, and I don't want to get too heavily into this, it's yet to go be examined by the Select Committee, but we will be looking also at the communication principles, and Chester Boris spoke about one of them. I note principles 2 and 3. Principle 2, a digital communication should not be threatening, intimidating or menacing. And so it'll be interesting to compare, for example, the Minister of Justice's own tweets over the last several months under that provision to see just how compliant they are. And then we might even look not just at the Minister of Justice's tweets, but her good friend Cameron Slater's contributions on the internet to see how much, the extent to which they comply with these communication principles. Principle 3. A digital communication should not be grossly offensive to a reasonable person in the complainant's position. Well, every time Wailua takes a breath, of course, he's in breach of that provision. But the question there is, of course, I think lawyers will be having a field day with what is a reasonable person in the complainant's position. That looks like a shifting test, and the courts will be having great difficulty with it. So, no doubt, with the assistance of the erstwhile Scott Simpson, there will be considerable consideration given, and as Mr Simpson shepherds the bill through, and I know that he will be wanting to make sure, for the sake of his own reputation, that he will want a good quality piece of legislation coming out of the sausage factory that is Select Committee consideration, something that he can proudly stand up and defend. And so, Mr Speaker, the communication principles will be one area that we will be looking closely at. There will be the offences. So clause 18 of the bill sets out an offence provision, and the question will be asked, of course, why do we not just resort to contempt of court provisions? If it is an offence to breach an order, why do we need to have this offence provision that requires separate enforcement? If the court has made an order and it is breached, then that is a contempt of court, and so the existing contempt of court provisions, I would have thought, would apply. But let's examine that. Let's look at that a little more closely. In clause 19, there is a very interesting, and I would say infelicitous, use of the English language, where it refers to, in clause 19(1)(b), harm. One of the questions is to be posed is, a person commits an offence if posting the communication would cause harm to an ordinary reasonable person. So we no longer have just a reasonable person, it is an ordinary reasonable person. And I don't know what the difference is between an extraordinary reasonable person or a reasonable person who is no longer ordinary. And I think we will need to tease out exactly what that means. I would hate to be considered to be just an ordinary reasonable person. I think I'm a reasonable person, but I don't think I'm necessarily an ordinary reasonable person. But I don't also want to be considered an extraordinary reasonable person. So let's understand exactly what that is, because we want this legislation to be meaningful and to speak to the vast bulk of people who are going to be looking to it for some sort of protection. We know what the ill is that this bill is trying to remedy, and it is the nasty, ugly stuff that goes up on Facebook and on other social media and on blog sites and other things. And people can be not just offended, but harmed, seriously harmed by some of the things that are put up. And this is not a recipe for not calling those in public office to account. I think people in public office stand in a separate category, but people who are going about their daily lives, ordinary citizens who can make mistakes or who can attract commentary and criticism, should not be beaten up in these fora that are now so public and so widespread and so easily accessible. So we understand all that. I want to finally just refer to the safe harbour provisions that the Associate Minister talked about, and we think they are a sensible measure, a sensible protection for the internet service providers. They shouldn't be caught up, at least in the initial complaint phase that will take place under this legislation. But of course they do have some responsibilities, and we need to know that the internet service providers and other hosts, once damaging and harmful material is drawn to their attention, we need to know that they understand their duty, if only a moral one, is to respond with alacrity, to remove it, to at least suspend broadcast of the posts and of the material until, if there is to be court action or some sort of application under this bill, that at least is resolved. So those are sensible provisions, and I can see that we would be quite happy to support those. So, Mr Speaker, I think this will be a useful contribution. There are some contentious issues here. Let's see if we can get around the table and resolve them and make this a meaningful and workable set of provisions for the people who are looking to it for the protection of their reputations and their dignity.
Scott Simpson.
Mr Speaker, it's always a pleasure to follow the reasonably unordinary